In today's video, we're going to be talking about the Department of Government Efficiency. The new president, Donald Trump, has tasked Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy with running this Department of Government Efficiency. One of the most common questions I get as a financial advisor, since we've been investing in Elon Musk's companies for the last decade or more, is how will this department be run? How is it going to be run differently than maybe other government departments, and what is it tasked to do? So what I'd like to tell you today is a little bit about what we've observed investing in Elon Musk's companies and how he runs his businesses, which we believe is going to be a blueprint for how he decides to run the Department of Government Efficiency. So first of all, I think one of the trademarks to Elon Musk is he paints a grand vision of what it is that he wants to do. So for example, SpaceX is a business that is designed to make life multiplanetary. Tesla is a business that is designed to help transition the world from fossil fuel-based energy to clean energy, to essentially sustainable energy. When he creates these visionary kind of ideas, it attracts some of the best and the brightest that share that vision, that look at it and say, oh, I want to stop doing what I'm doing to follow this guy because he's doing something that is awesome, that I believe in too, right? And right now, the vision for the Department of Government Efficiency is to essentially balance the budget. Right now, the US spends roughly $2 trillion more than it brings in. Take a look at this visual and you'll see what I'm talking about. On the right-hand side, you'll be able to see all of the line items of the money that we bring in, including taxes, individual and personal income taxes, business taxes, Social Security, which would include things like Social Security and Medicare taxes that are withheld from a paycheck, and then maybe some other taxes, which would be things like tariffs and other duties and things that the government imposes. And then on the left-hand side of the graph, what you'll see is all of the things that we spend money on, right? So Social Security, Medicare, discretionary spending, defense spending, net interest on the debt, which is now a massive chunk of the budget. It's actually bigger than the defense spending. And then other things, right, which are other programs. Purpose of the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, is to essentially fix this equation. We really haven't had a balanced budget since Bill Clinton. If you look, every president since him has created larger and larger deficits. So let's take kind of an Elon Musk approach. So he paints this grand vision that we are going to fix this. We're going to cut $2 trillion out of the budget. And so how will he do that? Another major principle that Elon Musk uses when he runs his companies is this idea of first principles thinking. So first principles thinking is essentially identifying a problem and taking it down to its core elements and saying, how would we solve this problem if we were doing it all over again and we weren't copying what somebody else already did? So take, for example, SpaceX. When SpaceX was first founded, the predominant belief was building rockets was expensive. Rocket launches cost billions of dollars, and there's no real way to make it inexpensive. What Elon Musk did that nobody else really kind of thought of was he said, well, wait a second, let's break this problem down to its core elements. What is involved in building a rocket? Steel, aluminum, titanium, fuel, electronics, things like that. Well, what do all of those things cost if you add them together? Only accounted for about 2 to 3% of the cost of a rocket. And so he said, why is launching rockets so expensive, right? Well, he set up his own manufacturing facility so he could actually control the costs and the inputs. And then he also figured out something else, which was, hey, we keep throwing away all these rockets. We launch them one-time use, we throw them away. What other things in life do we actually do that with? Do we do that with airplanes? Do we do that with cars? No, you reuse them, right? So this idea that, well, we should reuse rockets, launch them up, bring them back down, launch them up, bring them back down, and do this over and over again. At the time that he was doing this, everybody said, well, you really can't do that. And he didn't buy that. And he said, no, you can. It's a problem that needs solving. And today, Falcon 9 rockets, which are the workhorse of our fleet, essentially, are not only taking people to the International Space Station, coming back home, but essentially some of them have been reused 25 times, right? So imagine that you would have had to build 25 of those rockets. Instead, he's using one rocket 25 times, and they've had hundreds of launches this year. So this type of thinking does work. It's very difficult because obviously you take a problem that other people have solved in a different way, and you have to kind of bring it down to its core principles. But I believe that that's what he's going to do with this Department of Government Efficiency. So let's talk about some of the areas where potentially they're going to be able to find some cost saving. I believe that the first thing that they're going to be doing is looking at this and saying, okay, what's kind of a first principles approach to government? And they're going to look at every agency, I think, and kind of go down the line from there and say, okay, is this an agency that has a purpose? Meaning, what was it intended for? Is it fulfilling that mission? If it isn't fulfilling that mission, I think they're going to just recommend getting rid of that agency. The Department of Education was originally created in the 1950s, early 60s, to essentially make sure that white schools weren't siphoning off money from predominant black schools and essentially using that money to basically enrich themselves at the expense of another school. And there was some evidence in the 1950s that that was happening. This was during segregation and the integration of the school systems. But you create an agency, and that agency continues to grow and grow and grow. And so today, the Department of Education isn't really doing what Congress intended it for it to do. It's doing all kinds of other things, providing student loans, working on, different curriculum for schools that it's trying to push across the different schools. 90% of all the school curriculum and funding comes from the states and the local governments. Only 10% comes from the Department of Education. So you really got to ask yourself, what is the purpose of this? Was it intended by Congress? If it wasn't intended, do we even need it? I believe if they determine that we don't need it, they're going to say delete, which means get rid of it, right? And that is a major savings if you think about it. We have 450 agencies right now in the US government. If you could delete, a third of them, half of them, or even consolidate a bunch of them, that's a major win in the sense from the taxpayer's perspective. We're not spending that much money on things that perhaps we don't need. Okay, so that's going to be number one. I think delete redundant or ineffective agencies. Number two, a 2023 report by the Government Accountability Office. In this report, they basically talked about how there's 95% of the people that are working in the federal government right now are not going to work. They're not working in the office. So you got to ask yourself two questions on this. Number one, what do we have the office for if only 5% are going there? Could we get smaller offices? Yes, perhaps, right? Or should we insist that people go back to work? And the private sector is largely back to work. I think the government sector should probably do the same thing. And I think that's what Elon and Vivek are going to essentially probably push right away. When you look at the remote work and leasing of buildings, if you take out prison guards and security personnel at these buildings, the number goes down to something like 99% of government workers are not going into the office, right? So again, we got to look at this and see, is that job that the government worker doing possibly being done remotely? Could it be done remotely? Was it done remotely even before the pandemic? If so, maybe it continues and we eliminate the office. Or on the other hand, if the job wasn't being done remotely and it was something where, people were coming in, were people more productive back then, or are they more productive now? And obviously we can look at that, track it, figure it out. Also, do we have the offices in the right locations? In a 2022 audit showed that certain agencies were not able to verify whether remote employees were actually meeting their hours or performance goals. Now, what's interesting about that is, let's say, for example, I was hired in Washington, D.C., and I'm working in Washington, D.C., but now I'm fully remote and I've decided to move to South Carolina. I'm still getting paid as if I lived in Washington, D.C., and the government actually gives you a different pay scale if you're in a high-cost area like Washington, D.C. versus a low-cost area like South Carolina, right? Many government workers at this point are misrepresenting their living situation and collecting a Washington, D.C. paycheck and living in South Carolina. Now, to be clear, this is fraud. This, if you are in any private entity here and you did this, this is a fireable offense because it's fraud. You're misrepresenting something, collecting a much larger paycheck for something that you're not entitled to at this point. So just cutting out the fraud, just basically saying, hey, you don't live in Washington, D.C. anymore, you're in South Carolina, we're going to cut the paycheck accordingly, right, would save a bunch of money. If we break down the fundamentals, right, pay should reflect the cost of living, meaning in the area that you're working in. So if you're working in New York, you're getting paid New York salaries. If you're working in West Virginia, you're getting paid West Virginia salaries, right? Eliminate the blanket DC area pay for fully remote workers. So again, if you're fully remote, we're not going to insist that you go to the office, and we're not going to pay you as if you're living in Washington, D.C. when you're living somewhere else. And then reevaluate office space needs, right? So audit the federal offices, consolidate redundant buildings, sell off the ones that you don't, and then eliminate agencies and positions that are no longer necessary. Meaning, if Congress didn't state that this was something that was a goal of that agency, if Congress didn't say, Department of Energy, what we want you to do is push your theories on local school districts or administer student loans or do these things, what we wanted you to do was make sure that white schools weren't siphoning off money from black schools and there's no evidence of that happening now, let's close you down, right? We're going to just eliminate that agency entirely. If the federal workforce is about 2.1 million annually, 2.1 million employees. If just 10% receive inflated salaries due to COLA adjustments, that's 210,000 employees that are making more than they should. Assuming an average discrepancy of about $20,000 per year, that's annual waste of $4.2 billion. And again, this is fraud. You don't have to change anything. You just have to basically say, like, you said you were living in Washington, D.C., you're living in West Virginia, we're going to pay you for West Virginia. Also, if the Government Accountability Office reported federal government spends $1.7 billion annually on underutilized buildings, right? If you get rid of those buildings, forget even what you're going to get for selling them, just get rid of them. You don't have to heat them. You don't have to cool them. You don't have to secure them with security guards. It's another $1.7 billion annually. If they attack this problem the way that I think that they will, using first principles thinking, you can see how this can snowball into a lot. I don't know, again, if we're going to hit that $2 trillion aspirational vision that they painted for, but it's certainly going to be a movement in the right direction. And as a taxpayer, this is exciting for me. I want to see the government be more efficient. Again, I think it's something that spans, across the aisle. Both Republicans and Democrats can get behind something like this. In next week's episode, feel free to join us for part 2, where we're going to be talking about the national deficit and why we can't afford to waste a dime.